Good morning, everyone. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about chaos and complexity. And I chose those words because I wanted to stay away from the ideas of the dichotomy between chaos and order. A lot of times I think when we think about order, we think about control and somebody defining what order is the right order. And I want to stay away from that idea because I don't think that idea of order, or that concept of order, is particularly helpful when thinking about the complexity necessary for humanity to thrive. So first, I want to talk about last week a little bit. Last week we talked about happiness, and we talked about how to create it through perspective and gratitude. The discussion afterward, which by the way was extremely worthwhile, so if you're watching at home today, come on out to actually come to the services, because the discussion afterward is the part that really, I think, makes it, gives you the most value. Especially since it's free. It's the biggest return on investment for coming out. I guess it does cost your time. But it ended up, the discussion ended up talking about how happiness, or how can happiness help us make a better world, right? What is it about happiness, because we think about that just as a thing for ourselves, how does that help us make the world better for everyone else? And what we had talked about toward the end is the idea of exemplifying happiness to others. So being a happy person, being someone who's content with their life, and showing that to others, and then helping them to get to that place is a way to help build a world that trusts in each other, that's kind to each other, that allows us then to build community, right? To be humans together in the same space. And then to work together to solve problems. And we talked a lot about political problems and the problems of the environment today. But that starts with being able to build human connection. And so happiness is kind of a foundational piece that allows us then to divert our energy away from ourselves and focusing on what's making us miserable, to then invest it in others and in the connection with others. And I was thinking, as I was writing the service for this week, every challenge that we will overcome in the entirety of our existence is going to be solved by people connecting with others to solve it. Right? In all of human history, no one person solved a problem. A big problem. Right? It might have been some one person's idea, but they then had to connect with other people to wield the expertise and the skills and the resources, the investment necessary to then solve that problem. So if we think about it from that level, happiness, which then allows us to engage with others, is one of the foundational things that's going to allow us to solve any problem that we're going to come across. So I want to connect that to today in terms of the network of human connection. So our network of human connection that we're going to need to solve these problems is mind-bogglingly complex. Think about just in this room, all of the factors that came together to get us here today. You start kind of at the surface level. We had to get up. We had to motivate ourselves to go, right? So that comes from a level of self-contentment at least, right? We weren't miserable waking up in bed and saying, oh, I can't do anything. And then we got in our cars, which are a complex piece of equipment built by thousands of years of human development, across roads that happened to be clear enough to get here. We coordinated via Facebook to stay off a Clyde fan and the bikes that may or may not have still been driving today, to then arrive here at a preordained time, which is allowed to us anyway by our timekeeping devices that we invented. So when you think about all of the factors just for us to arrive in this room at a time together is extremely complex. And then you multiply that by 15 billion, and that's what it's going to take to fix things like the environment or our political system. But it started with us being in a place to make decisions to get ourselves here. So that's why I think today's topic of chaos and complexity is important, because I think it helps us to understand the forces that we're wielding when it comes to solving problems. So when I put it in the description, I put this as sort of the humanist version of good and evil, right? Chaos and complexity. But there's no inherent value assigned to either other than as a prerequisite for human development, right? Human existence is predicated on complexity, right? You've heard, if you look at space exploration and the way that planets develop, there's the Goldilocks zone, right? There's the very, very narrow band of specific circumstances that would allow carbon-based life such as ours to flourish. And if you think about that all the way from the beginning of the Big Bang until now, the specific things that had to happen, the numbers of stars that had to compress and explode and create certain elements that then coalesced into a planet of this particular type with a magnetic field, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, for us to then be able to develop over 4 billion years of the planet's history, et cetera, right? Or however many billion years, I picked a number out of my head, right? To get us to be here today is extremely complex. So we rely on complexity. And so the reverse of complexity is then chaos, right? Entropy, which is random disorder, right? It's the tendency of a system to fall out of order. That's the chaos I'm talking about, is entropy. I'm not talking about different ideas or opinions conflicting with each other. Those are usually still predicated on some levels of complexity. They're just different complex foundations. And chaos is also sort of the maximum distribution of energy in space, right? That it's most distributed, most even, most random. And so that's kind of what we're fighting against in terms of human existence. And again, it's not a force. It's not a guy, with a cloak and dagger. It's not some nefarious organization. It's just the nature of the universe to flux and create areas of complexity and then areas of chaos. But now that we exist as humans and we rely on this complexity to exist, to me, and I would argue from the humanist perspective, it makes the most sense for us to sustain our complexity, because that allows us to sustain our existence and then allows us to create the meaning and increase the complexity of that meaning that advances humanity. So complexity then, it's not just order, right? If you've ever, I'm going to go into my nerd zone for a minute. If you've ever played Assassin's Creed, which is a series of video games, has a lot of good philosophy in it, the forces are also chaos and order, but they're depicted as organizations that are trying to enforce a rigid order structure that's centrally managed, or people that believe in complete chaos and kind of destruction of that. And throughout the course of the game, the philosophy that it sort of espouses is that there's a balance between the two. And so when I'm talking about order, I'm not talking about that kind of order. What I'm talking about are sections of foundation that are stable, right? One of those things would be having an environment that would sustain human life, right? That is a foundation. There are many ways in which that might manifest, right? Maybe we end up living on a water world on another planet, or maybe we end up living in an ice age and we can still thrive, right? So there are different levels of that and different types of that are going to produce then different types of human complexity in terms of civilization development. But there is a sense of order in that foundation that the environment is necessary for human existence. And then there's an order and a complexity in the societies that we build. Now, we have many different societies, and some appear to be more stable than others at this point in human history. So that's a type of order, a type of complexity that then builds our foundation higher. But no one of those is the prescribed order that is necessary for human sustainment, right? There might be ups and downs for each of those things. And so that goes back to our discussions earlier on diversity, that maybe one of those is going to work and one of them is not going to work, and it's good to have both because we don't know which one's going to work out for us. But if we impose a rigid order where only one thing is allowed to be sustained, that's where we hit a point where we've negated our diversity and we're going to end up going down a dead-end path, but we can't see that yet. So I want to be very clear that I'm not promoting one order, because I think that's actually not beneficial to human survival. But complexity is necessary. And increasing complexity is a good, as long as we also maintain the optionality to go along with it. So the goal isn't just to have more humans, right? More humans does not equal more good, because that may not even equal more complexity. In fact, that might create more chaos. So as we see in the world today, we're currently degrading our environmental foundation, right? So we're reducing the complexity of that foundational base. We're eliminating species. We're arguably hitting the points of no return in certain pieces of the environment that are going to cause complexity to decrease and not allow it to serve as a foundation that's going to support human complexity. So it's about this overall, I don't want to say harmony, but this overall stacking construct that encourages complexity. So I think that's a really important thing to think about, because it allows us then to build that human narrative, right? So again, the number of humans is not nearly as relevant as I would say the richness of human complexity. And so we always talk about it as advancing the human narrative. Humans are narrative creatures. We understand our place in the world by the stories we tell ourselves, right? And everyone in this room has a story, and we know little bits about each other's story. And conceptually, and for some people they might even say spiritually, we form bonds with each other because we understand little bits of each other's stories. So we are all now connected to each other because we have been in this room at this point in time. Now, I'm not one to dwell upon the spirituality of things. I'm much more concerned about the functionality, but I think the two are synonymous. It just depends on how you interpret the world. So it's about enriching the complexity of that narrative, and not just for us, like my individual story, but the narrative of this group in this room, and the narrative of the community in which we live, and then the overwhelming tapestry of human connection and the meaning that we create together. Because when you look at it as a whole, it's almost as if we're one superorganism. All of humanity, because we're individuals, and yet we rely on each other to exist because we're social creatures. The society we built is the thing that sustains us. And we're going to talk more about humans as a superorganism next week. But when you think about it like that, that mesh, that conceptual mesh of connection between all of us is humanity. And the goal is to enrich that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we do that and what things serve as barriers to that. And so again, complexity could have come together in many different ways, and it still could come together in many different ways for the future. So it's not about the order that it's in, it's about the idea that there are these foundations that serve as steady basis for us to move forward from. So how do we think about complexity and chaos? Well, so one of those ideas is arguing against the idea of that more humans is more good, because that is one interpretation of humanism, in case you were wondering. And someone had brought it up, was that what we were after? It's just more humans. And I said, no, I don't think that's the right argument. Because what happens when too many humans, or when there are too many humans, and that creates that chaos that we talked about in terms of environmentalism, right? It's not that there's a set limit of number of humans that the Earth can sustain. I'm sure there are many different ways that number could flex. But it's about having that sustainable progress to enhance that complexity. And then, what happens when too many humans choose chaos? Right? Our system of government in our society relies upon trust. It relies upon us choosing to do the thing that is good for society. It relies on us using our front brain to not give into our immediate impulses and then focus on what's good long-term for our community. And that can be hard sometimes. And there are people that choose to break those rules, right? And society has a certain level of tolerance for that. We can absorb so much of that until there is a tipping point. And you've seen throughout history where societies have fallen into that tipping point and fallen apart. You know, when most of Europe went through the Dark Ages. So what happens when that happens? And is there a tipping point? What is it? Is it 30%? Is it 25%? Is it 40%? I don't know. But I'd imagine that there is some sort of tipping point beyond which, if there are enough humans choosing chaos or choosing to take advantage of a system of complexity, because any system is going to have its weak points, that the system begins to degrade. And I think that's important for us to consider as individual humans. When we make choices, we should try and focus our front brain, our rational brain, on choosing the things as best we can that we think are going to enhance complexity. And one of the reasons this is important is because it's easier to destroy than create. Right? Think about dominoes. When you set up dominoes, it's really hard. And then it just takes one nudge, so the energy input to destroy the system is much less than the energy required to build the system. And so I think that's important because a minority of people could create the downfall of a system. And I think we're seeing that today a little bit in our political system where, as voters, I would argue that we have ceded our power and abdicated our authority and allowed it to reside in a very small group of people who then end up executing that power. And if you go back to our foundational documents, at least in the US, I think the power still resides with us, but I think the window for using it is closing. And I'm not advocating one side or another in terms of politics, except for I think the power should return more toward the people. But that's on us. It's not on anybody else. No one's going to give it back to us. It's not how power works. But I think we need to realize that if a small number of people are causing us to go past that tipping point, then our systems of complexity that we rely on to exist are going to decay or even fall apart. And so what might cause people to not choose complexity or to choose chaos over complexity? Well, there are a lot of things. One, evolutionarily, we're not designed to think about all of humanity, right? We're designed to think about our tribe. We've talked about this before in terms of Dunbar's number. There's a number of people that you can really be familiar with and feel a connection with based on the way that our brain is programmed up to this point. And so that means if you don't have systems of education to then reinforce the use of your front brain and your rationality, we may fall victim to those impulses that cause us to choose chaos over complexity. So it's tribalism, low use of the prefrontal cortex, giving into impulse. And so if we flip that, what things cause us to choose complexity? How do we train that? How do we do that in aggregate? How do we do that as a human superorganism? How do we choose complexity on balance? So to a point, it's instinct, right? So we do have some instincts that help us to choose at least the family over ourselves, right? Self-sacrifice is something that humans do, and other creatures do it as well, right? Parents of other species will sacrifice themselves for their children. So there's that basic instinct that's there. And that's even shown in early tribal cultures going to war, going to battle. They realized that fighting for their tribe helped enhance the survivability of their children and their offspring. And then there's shared beliefs in culture, right? So it's the structures that we build to then coexist in a number larger than the Dunbar number, right? Larger than about 150 to 200 people, the tribe size. We build those cultures and those shared beliefs that allow us to then interact with lots of people on a basis of trust. Think about driving, right? We trust when our light is green, we can go. That's a big trust. That's a big trust fall right there every time you drive, right? Doesn't always work out, but I would say 95% of the time it does. And that system helps us to operate more efficiently. So those sets of beliefs, then systems, right? Our systems of law, our systems of political power, our systems of just how we treat people. Those things help us to then choose complexity. And we get trained in those things so they become a little bit more automatic. We don't have to use our brain power to then think about each thing of why, from me as an individual, do I have to build up this entire argument that gets us to, okay, this is the choice I should make. We make some of those things automatic so that it's just easier processing for us, shortcuts. And then processes, and this might be things that you're taught in combination with education, so processes in education, help us to understand the why, right? They might give us broader rules that we can apply in short succession to get to a decision about something. Why should I recycle, right? Someone's done the homework for us and said, well, this is why we should do this. This is why we should maintain our environment. This is why we should do these other things. And then the education helps us to be able to apply those. And particularly when I talk about education, I don't mean knowledge. I don't mean the things that you learn in school. I mean training people to use their ability to think critically to then apply the right kinds of questions to scenarios. Right? Why should I believe in these systems? Right? Why should I zoom out from myself and think about humanity and the community? That's the kind of education I'm talking about. And I think that's the most important kind of education that we should focus on, understanding how we are connected. And then there's training. There's a difference between education and training. So training would mean training yourself and engaging in training to help you counteract biases. Right? Biases were programs that were kind of put in our brain right early on in our evolution that helped us to take shortcuts to make quick decisions for survival. But some of them don't work well today. We've talked about negativity bias as one of those in particular. So how do we train ourselves to counteract those biases, right? Negativity bias, for instance, we use gratitude and perspective to help us counteract all the negative things that happen in our lives and help us to focus on the good things. But to train ourselves to question availability bias, right? So I see things around me, those things must be true or normal, right? I have to constantly question myself to say, maybe this isn't normal. Having been to places like Afghanistan lets me know that this is not how most of the world lives. So what we live in is actually fairly abnormal. Doesn't mean it's wrong. It just isn't what everyone else expects as a standard, right? That helps me then to maintain perspective, which then helps me as an individual be happier and engage in the kinds of behavior that I think help encourage more complexity. And then, of course, is using our front brain. Last week we talked about emotions a little bit. You're not going to be able to control which emotions you have, right? Those things are wired way back in there that they're going to hit your brain before your frontal cortex can really engage. But you can control what you do with your emotions. So realizing that we're going to have feelings because we're still human creatures and we're still an animal, right, to an extent, way back here. But then realizing that once it happens, setting a trigger in our mind saying, oh, I just had a feeling, right? And this is what they teach to kids, is if you can name your feeling, you kind of gain control over it a little bit. When you can just talk about, I'm feeling mad right now, you acknowledge it, and then you're able to process it, and you work through that. So realizing that we need to use that front brain to then make good decisions after our animal brain has had its run, has thrown its tantrum, or whatever it is. So then how do we actually create complexity? So up to this point, we've been very philosophical, right? All these forces that exist in the universe. But how do we do it? I'm talking about we in this room. How do we create complexity? So as we talked about last week, it's building human connection. Building connections with people maybe who are a little bit different than you. Helping to build the kindness and understanding that's necessary for even just basic human connection, even if it's someone who has ideas that you are completely opposed to, realizing that they're a human and they got to that place for reasons. They might not even be good reasons, but they're reasons. And giving them enough understanding to say, you might have gotten there, and it might be on faulty logic, and it might have been through bad training or brainwashing or whatever it is, but you're still a human and I'm still a human, and we're in this together. So let's work out how we can create some complexity and some meaning together to move forward. That's one thing that we can do. Which almost says stay off of Facebook, but we know that's not going to happen, right? Because we got to use the Facebook every once in a while. But build those human connections. Be kind to each other. Study, invent, build, maintain, sustain the complexity we have, sustain our environment, and those things that are the necessary conditions for our existence. Right? One of those things that, I don't know, months back, I was watching Wildcrats with my kids. It's a TV show for those who. It's a great TV show. It's all about the environment and animals and things. And they did a show on worms, and my kids were very interested in worms. And I was like, you know how we can study that? My kids are very small. I just made a compost pile. All right, I just raked a bunch of leaves together. I got like a little composting bin, and started doing composting in our yard. And so they get to learn about that. They get to learn a little bit about science and nature and things. But then I'm also helping to, regenerate nutrients, put them back in the soil, that sort of a thing. So those are kind of the small choices that we can make that may then help just in small ways. But in the aggregate, when everyone does it, if we came up with a recycling system that was sustainable to keep and process things in the country, and we were willing to pay the cost for it, because it does cost money, those would be things that we could do. And then oppose entropy, right? So impose the decay of complexity and order. And that manifests in a lot of different ways. So support norm building in flexible social constructs, not rigid social constructs, that help us to engage with each other and not separate us. Right? So engage in the conversations that do challenge people a little bit. Right? Train yourself to be able to do that respectfully and in a way that doesn't cause the other side to disengage. And that's very difficult. That takes a lot of practice. It's not something where we're going to be able to jump on Facebook and convince a naysayer in a couple of pithy quotes. Right? It's going to be real, sustained human engagement. And that's hard and takes energy. But when you go back to physics, right, it takes energy to create complexity. To stack and order things requires energy. And it's going to require us to invest that energy to build that complexity, even in relationships. So again, what does this look like in today's world? Be kind to others. Consider their perspective. Be an example for others to emulate. When other people lose their mind and just go off on a crazy rant, maintain composure. Maintain the ability to understand them. I'm sorry you feel that way, but you're still human and I'm still human, and so I'm here for you. Right? A lot of people want to get into fights, especially today. Just don't give them that opportunity. It's really fun to watch, too. When people get really frustrated and they want to have a fight and you won't fight with them, I have a really good time with that. Speak out for what's right. And this is up to you. Right? You're going to make a call on what's right. Try and still do it in that understanding way, but do speak out. Right? What we see today are the usually two fringes being extremely loud, when the majority of people are in the middle. But we're content with just kind of muddling through our lives, and we don't want to invest that energy into speaking for what's right. But if we did, we would be the overwhelming voice and say, everybody just chill out. Let's just work on this together. I think generally that would be the message that most of us in the middle have. Everybody just chill out. Just quiet down on the sides there. Let's work together toward something, not just yell at each other across this chasm of difference. Join with others to hold accountable or change systems if necessary. When I was talking about our system of politics and voting, we need to be engaged. We need to have conversations with each other and not feel like, well, I don't have the power, I'm just one person. But you're not just one person, you're one of many people who feel exactly the same way, and if we just communicated with one another, we'd realize that, again, we are likely the majority. That's a powerful thing that will require energy. Educate ourselves and offer education to others. To me, this is our largest return on investment in terms of complexity. Investing in your education and encouraging others to invest in their education is the thing that drives complexity. Think of all of the progress we've made in terms of human existence, and that came from education. And I'm not talking about school. I'm talking about going out and learning about things, how things work, how people work, how systems interact, how to fix things. It's more that classical education where you learn about chemistry and physics, where you learn about all of the different forces in the universe, and you learn about psychology, and you learn about just the human lessons of how to deal with conflict and communication. That's the kind of education that helps us to engage and build that complexity between ourselves. And then here's a big one. Understand the value of balance between progress and conservation. I've talked about this before. Progress is necessary for human survival and for us to thrive. We have to progress. We can't just stagnate where we are and say this is as good as it's ever going to get. That's not going to work, particularly in terms of when you look at the environment. But nor can we throw the lever of progress straight down to the ground and say full steam ahead, and we forget our story. We become disconnected from each other. It's basically if you had a cloth, right? And we stretch the cloth too far where it begins to rip. And we're losing pieces of our humanity because we're becoming disconnected. And this, I think, is important, not just in terms of politics, but in terms of human development generally. If we go too quickly, we lose track of who we are or who we were, and we don't have a consistent narrative that helps us to understand where we currently are. Now, this is a delicate balance, and I don't know where exactly on the slider between the two we should be, but we can't be all the way to one side or the other. If we're all the way on the side of conservation, that's stagnation. Everything stays as it is, power stays where it is, we don't progress, and eventually we come across some obstacle and we die because we weren't ready for it. But again, the opposite side is progress, and unfettered progress, which is where we get into problems possibly with developing AI that we can't control, or developing gene therapies that end up wiping out most of humanity or all of humanity, where we're not thinking about the ethical and the functional implications of that progress. Additionally, unfettered progress causes backlash, as I think we're seeing in the world today. So there must be a balance between those two, and we have to think about what that is. And then finally, expand your sense of self through education, training, conversation, engagement to include your community, and then ideally, in the long term, includes all of humanity, where at least as you're making decisions on a daily basis, you're considering, what does this mean for humanity? What does it mean that I'm spending time watching TV? Or what does it mean that I'm spending time raking the yard? Or planting trees? Or having a conversation? What does that mean? Every once in a while, not all the time, right? We'd be moving very slowly if we did that all the time, right? We've got to have some shortcuts that help us. But every once in a while, check in with yourself and say, what am I doing to affect all of humanity? So with that, thank you for coming out today. I hope this was an interesting conversation or an interesting topic for you all. For those of you who are out there, again, come on out, because the discussion afterward is usually where we really get to delve into the complexities of this. It's really hard to cram all of the perspectives into one presentation. So I really welcome you to come out. And again, the reason we call this a service is not because I get up here and say a bunch of words. It's that we come together to serve each other by building those connections, to let other people like us know that we have a place, and we have a group, and we have connections, and we're all part of something bigger. To me, that's the real service, that you come to this place and this time. So for those of you at home, as we usually do, reflect on something that you were grateful for in the week previous and something you're looking forward to in a week to come. And then we hope to see you here next week, where we think about humanity as a superorganism. So thank you and have a great week.